Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday live stream. Um, I wanted to talk to you today about why I recommend actually that leaders maintain some sort of overview of what's happening in their organization around their injury, like their injured workers or their injury claims, and particularly around the psychological injury claims. But it doesn't just involve psychological injury claims, because what we notice is that people who actually have a physical injury in the workplace, depending on what it is, will often end up with some level of secondary sort of psychological impact anyway. And especially when they're having to deal with insurance companies that, often once the claim is moved out of the hands of the employer, if an injured worker's, particularly if they're off work altogether, that we've kind of got to work in how, some of the interactions when they're at home or not available to work, or if they're on, different kind of duties in the workplace, that sense of feeling like they're still a valued member of the team, and that their contribution, whatever they're making in terms of that contribution, is still something that's valued by the employer. And it's a really important thing. I talk about often the ability to get some level of recovery at work. And depending on the injury, somebody might be, we used to talk about in the old days as, oh, somebody's back on light duties. It's that kind of idea that for whatever reason, a person has had some sort of injury claim in the workplace. And often that means that if they're not able to do their normal job, we're kind of not sure what work we can give them to do or how to engage them. And in other cases, and I heard of another case more recently where somebody actually had a physical injury that was not related to the workplace, but then the employer was a little bit reticent to let that person come back on any form of kind of light duties. So I want you to think about somebody, breaks their ankle at football over the weekend and they're not able to do their normal job. And so they can take complete time off work. But if it was something that was a long-term thing, and the doctor says, well, maybe they can go back to work on some sort of light duties, often the employer will kind of just go, oh, no, I've got nothing for you to do if you can't do that job. But, if there's some negotiation or opportunity for that person to help out in some other way, and they may be able to make some level of contribution to the workplace, they often feel much better engaged and supported. And that's a big part of the sort of challenge that we talk about when we have people who are, experiencing some level of injury in the workplace. What are the sorts of things that we can do to keep them engaged? And so I want to come back to this idea about, psychological injuries for obvious reasons. Last week, I actually talked about in the webinar that I did around bullying and harassment, and how our approach to bullying and harassment in the workplace can really have a big impact. And that there are ways that we could do things, or alternative options that we have when we start looking at how we engage a person in the workplace that might reduce the likelihood that they feel, that they've been bullied or harassed. In much the same way, if we find that we reach a point where somebody goes off on stress leave, I find that especially in larger organizations, often the leaders aren't even aware that that's happening. And you know even a HR manager may be aware of it, but obviously you can understand the bigger the organization, the less kind of insight the leader actually has into who's off for what reason, unless they're getting this really high level aggregated data about the, number of people on what we call unplanned leave. So we have these sort of extremes between, never having insight except for the fact that, oh, 5% of our people are using up all their sick leave in a year, as opposed to the other end of it where you've got small business that actually knows and really feels it if somebody actually takes a day off work because they're sick. And I think a lot of this stuff, with people in and out of the work environment, with COVID, we've become much more flexible about, well, if somebody's unable to be in the office, that they can actually work from home, that there's this flexibility around these sorts of things. But when somebody actually gives you a medical certificate that says that they've gone off on stress leave, that is a red flag. And it's a red flag that should be something that goes all the way to the top. And a lot of places, like the supervisor will just kind of like, they get the medical certificate or they code it in. It just gets coded in as your standard sick leave, right? Or in lots of cases, we don't differentiate it. It comes up as, personal leave. But I think it's really important that when we have some sort of acknowledgement that there's a person who's claiming that they're off on stress leave, that this is one of the elements that we actually need to kind of go, okay, they're off on stress leave. What do we need to do to actually make sure that the issue around the stress leave is something that is identified and intervene early? Because it's the stress leave that may or may not be related to the work environment. But we need to know if it's related to the work environment, right? Because if it is related to the work environment, that stress leave is likely to turn into a workers' compensation claim. And so there's this opportunity in that early intervention space that if you have somebody who presents with a medical certificate that says they're off on stress leave, we had no knowledge that within that team or that person's role that there was a problem, then the notification that we get that says stress leave, as opposed to they're just sick or they've got COVID or the kids are sick or whatever, is a red flag opportunity for the person at the top to kind of go, hang on, here's my problem. And it's like the orange light, it's the warning that says, hang on, Danger Will Robinson, there's something that's going to happen here, or there's something that's come up that's led this person to feel like they can't be in the work environment. And I'm going to suggest that it's really important that that kind of clarification, because this is something that we haven't done traditionally either. What happens is somebody will submit a medical certificate for stress leave. The person that gets it is their supervisor. If the supervisor is the one that's involved in the fact that they're stressed in the first place, that supervisor is not necessarily going to want anybody else to have any insight into the fact that that's happening. But if there was a traffic light system that says if it's stress leave, then it automatically gets escalated. And everybody knows that. So that if it's stress leave, it also has to go to the supervisor, but then it has to go to the head of HR as well. That there is a point of escalation that means that somebody independent of that person's work area is going to then make some contact with them and go, I'm really sorry to hear that you're off on stress leave. I'm hoping that there's something that I might be able to do to support you. Would you mind if we have a chat about, whether or not this is a work-related issue? And if so, I'd really like to support you in it. If it's not a work-related issue, perfectly understand, is there anything that we can do to help? Because it's that intervention at that point that most businesses don't do. And it's because, we're told, oh, somebody gives you a medical certificate, you have no right to ask them anything about why they're off. But if the doctor writes on it that it is a stress-related issue, then there can be in your policies something that says, if it's a stress-related thing, we're going to have somebody independent of your work area who's going to make contact with you and make sure that if it's something to do with the work environment, that we're actually addressing it in an early intervention way. And we can do this now because on the back of COVID, we can talk about this in a well-being way. Part of our well-being strategy is to make sure that if somebody says they're going off work on stress leave, then that's our opportunity to intervene early and make sure we can support your well-being by making contact with you and asking if there's anything that we can do to support you, given that, stress has led you to be unwell. And we really want to help you, and we think that's important. And I can almost guarantee, that if we start to do this, we're going to start to see the numbers of people who take off time, stress leave is going to start to reduce because they'll feel like there's another escalation process. So the next level of this is to bring into your organization, as part of that well-being strategy, this sense that if there is a feeling within the work environment, that bullying and harassment stuff that I talked about in the last webinar, that we do have this kind of escalation point, that we give people an alternative pathway. But, Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So the first thing that we need to do is then start to just implement a policy that says, hey, if you go off on stress leave, we want to make sure, as part of your well-being, that we've checked in to make sure that there's nothing that we can do to support you, and, do our level best to make sure that, this situation that you're in doesn't kind of get any worse. Even if it's a personal issue, you still want to be aware of it so that we can make sure that this person is not then treated like, poor performance kind of process, right? Really important that we put our money where our mouth is when we sort of say well-being is a really important part of working in this organization. All right. So I hope that that was interesting. I hope that that's something that's valuable. If you watch this live, great. You can put some comments below. I'll come back in and check on those comments later on if there's anything that anybody particularly wanted me to talk about or address. If you found this useful or interesting, of course, please feel free to share it around and let other people know, especially because this is an important kind of area around leaders needing to understand the real numbers rather than it just kind of coming to you in the annual report and you're kind of blindsided by why this is happening. All right. So I hope that helped. I will see you in another week. See you for the live next week where I'll be talking about prevention again. All right. See you soon.